Welcome back to Explore by NG Bio, where we go inside what's next in women's health, and I'm your host, Deniz Bakkalcı. Today, I'm speaking with Diana Torgeson, Head of Innovation Ecosystem Integration at Organon, one of the few pharma companies fully dedicated to women's health. Diana's role sits at the intersection of science, partnerships, and execution, and today we're talking about what an ecosystem approach actually looks like in 2025, where the real bottlenecks still exist, and how we move from research and pilots to scalable, real world solutions. Diana, thank you so much for joining us on the Explore podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to say thank you to all the listeners as well for caring about women's health. It's a huge medical need, a huge space, and we need every effort we can to execute on it.
Absolutely, and we can't be more grateful. Let's start by setting the scene. So, you have worked across sectors and now you're building ecosystems within Organon. What brought you here and how do you define your role?
I have this privilege of building this role in a huge, big company that, as you said, is the only company this size or bigger that is dedicated to women's health. So, what brought me here is the fact that women's health, and we should think about how we define women's health. It's usually reproductive health, things, diseases that are unique to women, but that's not necessarily true. Women, they have different pharmacological properties when they swallow drugs. So that means the treatments that they take treat women differently than men. And women have different profile of diseases. So there's diseases that affect women differently and disproportionately. All of that is women's health. So health is really women's health. It's women are just different from men fundamentally. So it's a big area. And I see that as a not as a niche market. This is a space where you can help many, more than 50% of the population, in fact. So that's what brought me to Organon. That's what brought me to be working in women's health. And what I do in my role is what we want to do is to enable a sustainable innovation ecosystem. And what we really mean by that, and we'll go into this down in our conversation, hopefully, is that not one player can do this alone. Not one player can innovate, bring things to the patients. It takes a village. It takes an ecosystem of innovators, academics, medical providers, etc. All of us need to work together to enable new innovation to get to patients. And there are many patients out there. The medical need is huge on many different levels. So that is what my role is. It's working with all of those players out there to work together with Organon to improve the health of women.
That's a fantastic answer, and it's really inspiring to see how your background and also passion combines and brings you where you are right now. As you described, you are trying to bring things to patients. It takes an innovation, as you said, and you mentioned ecosystem. When it comes to women's health, what does an effective ecosystem actually look like in practice? So, beyond just using the word ecosystem, but what is it actually?
So I actually like the word ecosystem because what that just implicates is that there is not one single player, not one single stakeholder that can solve a whole problem. And the ecosystem, and I represent pharmaceutical industry, the medical industry. These are regulated industries. That requires that we have many players working together through the value chain of innovation. So, for example, we need doctors and we need scientists to understand what the disease is, what is wrong in the cell, what are the molecular pathways that are different from a diseased state to a healthy state. So we need academia to start and look at this is mostly where it happens in academia. We need a huge academic effort to start understanding and learning about women. We need translators. These are usually biotechs and VCs that then start translating and drugging these differences to correct them. And then we need regulators. We need pharmaceutical companies to come into that mix as things mature. And then we need healthcare providers. We need many different players that then take that approved innovation, that approved product, and bring them to the patient once it's on the market. So it's not just one player that can do this. This whole ecosystem is all of these players that hand off from one sort of, I think about it as a stafette. So you just kind of hand off things to each other as they advance through the system to finally end up at the patient's at the bedside with the patient to make a difference. So that's what that's how we think about the ecosystem. It's all of those players that are needed at different stages to progress innovation.
Right. That point about no single player being able to solve the whole problem really resonates, especially in women's health. If we can unpack that a little bit, where do you think good intentions in women's health innovation are still breaking down? Is it in the hands of between players or something deeper?
The way we look at this, and the way if you look at the data, and if you look at especially historic data, there has been not a single point where things have broken down for women's health, but there's been a historic lack of many things that have led to the status quo we have today. So what is if we go back to how we think about innovation getting to the patient starts with basic science, knowing what things are, that science being translated, women being included in clinical trials where we learn how these things play out in clinical trials in humans, once how we translate basic science to humans, the regulatory bodies, and then the whole market, all the players on the market points have been left behind for women and have excluded disadvantaged women when we look back in time. So I wouldn't say it's one thing that is breaking down. I think it's this cumulative effect that we don't know what, for example, endometriosis is. We don't really understand it. We don't have many drugs and molecules that are in development to cure it. Very few patients are in clinical trials, and so we're not learning from what clinical trials and what this looks like in humans. FDA and regulatory bodies haven't been updated, and I heavily skew towards safety versus efficacy. And because of that, we haven't seen new innovation flood the market, and that makes it more difficult to access patients, to access good pricing, et cetera. So it's a cumulative effect of many different steps that have led to this situation where we now have a negative spiral. And what we're trying to do, and whatever I want to galvanize everybody else to do, and what many are trying to do, is to make that spiral actually go up, to be a positive spiral that builds on successes bit by bit.
That's such an important point when women have historically been left out by different players. Building on that, since you got the visibility across the entire innovation life cycle, what do you think is the consistent disconnect between promising early stage work and actual long-term adoption? Is this the point you were referring to?
I think it's an interesting question. If you think about basic science being translated and getting to a point where the drug is approved as something of an innovation push, then there is the market pull, right? It's how many patients can you access? How many patients want to take this? And frankly, what is the pricing of this to make that big effort? So taking a drug to a market takes about 15, 16 years and about $2.5 billion. How do you bring that return back into research again to start that cycle again? And I do go back and forth, which one's more important? Do we want to, what is the most promising early stage work for long-term adoption? I do actually land a lot of times that we need more of the innovation push. We can't solve the market pull. Market rewards innovation. And so we need to get innovation to the patient and say, look, we do have disease modifying drugs now. We do have things more than is just hormonal treatments. This is innovative. This is using latest technology, and this is making a big difference in moving the needle for patients. So I do believe that we need to start with more basic science, more translation, more innovative things, and then go challenge some of the regulatory hurdles we're seeing and some of the market hurdles we're seeing. So that's where we need to focus. And we are seeing a lot more good research coming through and people looking at women not as just small men, but as actual research worthy subjects, and looking into some diseases that are real diseases, but have been dismissed for eons.
Well, that sounded quite positive from my end, at least. So it's good to hear that. And we know that Organon is uniquely focused on women's health. Are we seeing a real shift in how pharma and Organon specifically engage earlier and more openly with startups and academic innovators?
So Organon is definitely committed to women's health. We are definitely committed to innovative solutions, and we're committed to the ecosystem, which means everything from groundbreaking science to transformative solutions, and also advocacy to solve some of these problems that exist, some of the hurdles that exist to bringing these solutions to the market. For us, it's vital. I do want to, for pharma as a whole, we unfortunately don't have that many players who are specifically citing being part of women's health. But what you do see historically as well is that when innovative solutions get developed until late stage, pharmas that haven't necessarily been in women's health are there and are willing to take a look. And when we talk about this other pharma, I do want to be very clear that when it comes to oncology, many pharmaceutical companies are in oncology and do serve women, such as breast cancer and other cancers that are specific to women. So when we talk about this, we really are talking we're excluding oncology, where a lot of pharma actually engages extremely early. For Organon, this is the engagement with the external ecosystem is vital, but pharma is in general very versed with this ecosystem engagement. There's a statistic out there that's been pretty consistent over years whenever it's been measured, and it's that no matter the size of the pharma, so this is for the top 20 biggest pharmaceutical companies, about 70% of drugs originate outside of internal R&D. So no matter the budget, some of these pharmaceutical companies have enormous budgets. Majority of the portfolio products that they have originated one way or another externally. So the ecosystem, the research that happens outside of pharma is vital. And this is what we've known for many decades in pharma. We know that the nimble, the innovative ecosystem out there, that is what is going to come up with the best solutions. And we need to be there to support it and receive it and then bring it to the patient. So we recognize the need for ecosystem and strengthening it. At Organon, and we're developing ways of engaging with academics and especially with biotech and translators, such as those in the biotech. We're starting an accelerator program. We're developing many other solutions to tap into and support those early stage innovators to bring them to a stage where they can start developing clinical data, clinically validated data packages that Organon can benefit, or maybe somebody else, but as long as we want to see it come to the patient.
That is really interesting distinction, especially your point about pharma often stepping in at later stages, and it speaks to why structure and intention matter so much earlier on. Can you share a concrete example, ideally in women's health, can be outside women's health as well, where something actually moved from concept to impact because the right structures, incentives, or partnerships were in place?
Yeah, I do. I want to, I want to maybe share an example of other areas where this has changed, because we talk about women's health as being hampered, but I want us to realize that in the historic perspective, there are many therapeutic areas that have been neglected and that have had hurdles to face where innovation wasn't able to flow to the patient. This is women's health sometimes feels like we're unique and that we're left out, but this happened to many different therapeutic areas. And then something has changed and things have opened up and innovation has flowed. And so I usually use the example of nephrology, but there are many other therapeutic areas such as orphan disease and others where there were hurdles that held back innovation. So in nephrology, what happened is that the regulatory framework changed. So nephrology used to be essentially cardiovascular. So anything that was addressing anything in the nephrology space really had to do huge phase 3 trials that had cardiovascular outcomes. That was extremely expensive and couldn't be justified for the amount of patients that were out there in the system. And the second thing that happened that nephrology had is that the way the drugs were being priced in nephrology was through so-called bundled system. So now what happened is that FDA changed their regulatory framework to more surrogate endpoints, and the pricing changed to individual drugs. That immediately led to an innovation push because there was always the medical need out there. Those patients were always waiting for better treatments and better approaches. There were just these hurdles that were standing in the way of innovative solutions reaching them. And so when you remove those hurdles, things started to flow because people knew how to get through things as how to get through this, from science to patient in a more lean, in a more efficient way.
Right. I think this example is quite powerful because it's a reminder that women's health isn't the only space that has been overlooked, but also that change is possible when the right frameworks evolve.
That's exactly right. We have a chance to change this. It takes work but there are precedents and others have done it, and so can many of the therapeutic areas within women's health can go through this transformation.
Right. So if you were to apply that lens to women's health today, and could you redesign just one part of the pipeline, whether regulatory, clinical, or commercial, where would you start to create that same kind of momentum?
So, there's, as I said, unfortunately, in women's health, the hurdles have been many, everything from lack of basic understanding of disease to clinical trial inclusion and market hurdles. The thing that sits in the middle of both innovation push and market pull is regulatory strategy. And regulatory has a huge impact. The regulatory bodies, such as the FDA, have a huge impact on how innovation is and how there's a market pull and an innovation push, and really balances those two sides. And I think if we can focus on regulatory, um, and working with the regulatory bodies to explain that we need more innovation in women's health and for women, and work with them, that could open up this flow that we're looking for, innovation to patient. I really would like to focus, if I had to pick one, it would be a regulatory hurdle to work on. And you can approach the regulatory bodies in two different ways, but the most effective one, again, going back to how nephrology changed it, is coming with data packages. So this is kind of what leads me to back to my conclusion that we need that innovation push. We need more innovative solutions coming to the regulatory bodies, FDA and EMA, and explaining, showing the data and saying, this is how it is, and this is how we believe the regulatory endpoints should be structured, and how the regulatory playbooks should be structured. But we need more innovators to come and have that conversation with the regulatory bodies.
Right. Actually, this kind of complemented my next question beautifully. It is clear that how deeply the regulatory environment shapes both the push and pull sides of innovation, especially when clinical trial inclusion is sort of coming from behind. If
Mm.
regulation sets the tone for what's possible, it also can hold a lot of potential to unlock what's next. So I was actually going to ask, and in your view, what's one underused lever, whether policy, partnerships, or something else, that could move the women's health field forward and faster?
Yeah, I do agree that policy is important. This is where we need policy both on the regulatory side, we need policy on research. So research is usually sponsored by governments, and this is where we need them to understand that this is investment in women's health research benefits everybody, the whole community, and is a good investment. So policy is very important. But so that's something that we really can't, I think that could give big returns. That's a big lever. But really where I'm getting at is that the big lever here is that we need to have more solid science and better understanding. And if we can have that, we will have more targets, more opportunities to address these diseases, and that would give us an opportunity to develop better drugs. That will give us an opportunity to get more impact and medical outcomes for patients, and a better pricing, which will turn the tide on the vicious cycle. So I think one of the levers that we can really pull is thinking about better science and more money to translation of that science.
Right.
And this is where venture capital really actually also comes in as a big player.
That emphasis on policy actually really highlights how upstream investment can benefit the entire ecosystem. So I think early innovation is very important, especially in women's health, and it creates more space for industry to engage meaningfully. Speaking of that, so for founders working at the early stage, before policy has caught up, or the data is all there, what would you like to advise them to have in place before approaching a company like Organon? What signals that a collaboration is worth pursuing from your side?
Good advice to any biotech is to reach out to pharma early and keep having the dialogue and keep having the input from pharma as they build. So even if you reach out to pharma early and they say, no, we're looking for later stage, keep having that conversation. It's always worth to keep the stakeholders updated and show progress and incorporate feedback. So I think it's definitely worth reaching out. I think the more companies that are out there also and do reach out to pharma companies and say we are developing innovative, that will also make them realize that there is are companies out there that they can choose from, because historically there hasn't been any good companies to invest in, to buy, even for those that have wanted to be in women's health, and that problem still exists. There isn't that much to choose from. For example, if you want to go into endometriosis but you only want to buy clinical assets, it's a handful at best. So I think it's good to start going to pharma early. But and the second thing I would say, if you really, and now we're talking about regulated products, it's focusing on solid science where you're not going to get response. And I don't want to dismiss the hormonal axis, because what we are seeing now, where we're having more research into it, that hormones, so estrogen and other hormones, are really valuable tools in our toolbox, and that we don't know as much as we thought we knew about them. So they are, but they're there as a solution. They're already on the market. What pharmaceutical companies are looking for, solid novel science. That's what I would give advice on, for companies not to do another reformulation, another me too of what already exists out there, but rather look at what are the new pathways that we can address to really move the needle that's different from what we have today.
Right. I think these are all very valuable advices. It reframes pharma not just as an end game partner, but as a thought partner throughout the journey.
That's right. That especially important in women's health. And this is where Organon and I'm particularly passionate about working together with early innovators, because we also historically haven't developed management teams that are very good. If you in oncology, there's so many CMOs and drug developers that have taken a drug from a petri dish to the patient, so they know how to do it. Not many people have gone to the FDA for PCOS, endometriosis, or anything like that. You need find those pharmaceutical companies that have those capabilities to supplement yours.
Right. Keeping that dialogue going early really helps shape something that's ultimately more translatable and scalable. So all makes sense. And it is a really great note to end on, Diana. Thank you for sharing such clear and grounded insights.
Thank you for having me, and I hope that there is a positive takeaway, because what we're seeing is a lot more galvanizing forces behind women's health, better research, more awareness amongst patients, amongst venture capitalists, and amongst pharma as well. So we just need to have this momentum going, and podcasts like this really benefit that. So thank you for having me on here.
Thank you so much. And you really given us a clear picture of what it takes to build systems that actually deliver. So thank you so much for being here again. And for everyone listening, this is what Explore is about: asking better questions and surfacing the operators, investors, and builders who are changing the game in women's health, like Diana. I'm Dennis, and this was Explore. See you next time.